Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar, International Affairs webinar on Turkey's changing role in the global order. This webinar is premised on the recent issue of the International Affairs Journal, in which the three articles written by the authors, written by the speakers here, was present, and this discussion is going to be premised on these articles, and we will have conversation with the authors. So the Turkey's role in international affairs is a hotly debated, is widely contested topics. The drivers of Turkish foreign policy, the motivation of it, the ideological roots of this policy, the orientation of it, the implication of it is hotly debated both in the West and in international, at the international level broadly, including in Turkey. And today we will try to understand basically how Turkey sees in its place in the world, what is changing in Turkish foreign policy, and what does it mean by focusing on the different aspect of the Turkish foreign policy or the Turkish role in the global order. We have three excellent panelists and excellent speakers. Mustafa Kutlay, who was the author of the Turkish foreign policy in a post-Western order, strategic autonomy or new form of dependence. This he wrote this article in cooperation with Ziya Öniş, a very well-known Turkish scholar. We have Katerina Dalacoura, associate professor at London School of Economics. Her piece focused on Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East, power projections and post-ideological politics. Katerina is well known to many people, I think, here. And then last but not least, we have Ariel Gonzalez Levaggi. He wrote a piece in partnership, he co-authored a piece with Federico Donelli that is titled Turkey's Changing Engagement with the Global South. So as you can see, as the title of these journal articles indicate, we are trying to cover quite a broad range of topics and issues in this webinar. I will be starting actually with Mustafa by posing a very simple question. But before we go to Mustafa, some housekeeping rules. Please post your questions. If you have questions, please post them into the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. I might also call upon you to pose your questions directly, but please post your question in the Q&A session if you have one. So now with Mustafa. So Mustafa, a very simple but at the same time quite a hard question to you. What is changing in Turkish foreign policy? What aspect of this policy is exactly changing? And what does it mean in Turkey's place in the global order?
All right, Galip, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event. In my short intervention, in order to address your question, Galip, I'm going to discuss how Turkey's foreign policy behavior over the last 2 decades has gradually shifted from the logic of interdependence to a quest for a strategic autonomy. In early 2000s, the logic of interdependence constituted the driving motives of Turkey's foreign policy. I mean, Turkey pursued a regional integration strategy based on economic and cultural linkages. It acted as a neutral mediator in regional conflicts and positioned itself as an ambitious humanitarian actor, drawing on soft power instruments. Turkey also improved its relations with the European Union, as we all know, as a negotiating candidate country. However, in mid-2010s, Turkey's conception of its national role has changed significantly. I mean, the logic of interdependence was gradually replaced by a search for autonomy, accompanied by interventionism and coercive diplomacy. And this has become much more pronounced, particularly following Arab upheavals and civil war in Syria in particular. So we argue in the paper that the paradigm shift can be understood as an outcome of 3 interrelated transformations at global, regional, and domestic levels. To start with, the liberal international order is undergoing a dramatic transformation. With the relative decline of the West and re-emergence of new power centers, the world is moving towards a post-Western order. I mean, this is a hotly debated issue, big question in international politics, as you know, and the readers of international affairs are quite familiar with this discussion because excellent pieces have been published over the last 5 years or so. So one of the consequences of waning unipolarity is the expansion of autonomous space for regional and middle powers. So in the Turkish context, the autonomy-based foreign policy discourse has two manifestations. The first one is that in this perspective, Turkey is considered as part of Global South. It is a potential BRICS member, developing closer relations with Russia and China, and joining other non-Western powers to advocate and capitalize on emerging multipolarity. And the second paradigmatic manifestation has been a shift away from the West, notably in political values and collective identity. So as we developed in the paper, autonomy in this context has become a byword for the step-by-step institutionalization of a transactionalist turn in the Turkey-EU partnership. Turkey's diverging regional security priorities or concerns with the Western powers, particularly United States in the Middle East and North Africa, also informed this process, but I'm sure Katerina is going to talk much more about the regional dimension of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East. So that is broadly how Turkish foreign policy transformed over the last 2 decades. But Turkey's foreign policy activism, as we argue in the paper, goes well beyond its material capabilities. That is a middle power acting like a great power or a global player. So I think this is an important question, deserves a separate answer. Actually, how do we account for Turkey's assertive foreign policy behavior over the last decade or so, based on the projection of hard power beyond its material capabilities? Because the recent foreign policy activism goes beyond moderate status seeking or quest for autonomy. In order to understand why, I think we need to look at the politics of Turkish foreign policy. I mean, we argue autonomy seeking also serves as a domestic legitimating discourse in the Turkish context, which has paid dividends for the ruling elite by boosting popularity. To put it in a nutshell, in the absence of robust institutional checks and balance mechanisms, foreign policy moves have been defended on the ground of security concerns. Yet they should also be analyzed as a diversionary tool and fragment domestic opposition. So regime dynamics, we argue, explain why Turkey is inclined to go beyond its material capabilities or simple balance of power politics. I would be more than happy to discuss this in further detail in the Q&A section.
Actually, a direct question to you here. The quest for strategic autonomy is nothing new in Turkish foreign policy. If you look at early AK Party era, the era in which the government enjoyed quite close relation with the West, the era the government was quite popular internationally, even back then there was an emphasis on the idea of strategic autonomy. Davutoğlu's ideas such as Turkey being a central state, refusing Turkey being seen as basically reduced to being part of certain bloc, to some extent indicated the idea that Turkey needs to have some form of strategic autonomy. So in this regard, do you see this quest for strategic autonomy to be something of recent, or has it always been around, but only the manifestation of it has changed?
Well, that's an excellent question, Galip. Thank you very much. I mean, there are continuities for sure. I mean, if you look at Turkish foreign policy in the 2 decades of 21st century, there are certain continuities. And strategic autonomy also was an issue in the previous decades, if not explicitly stated or clearly formulated. But the thing is that when we look at the last decade or so, we see 2 particular developments, I think, which are unique. I mean, first of all, we develop a critical understanding of strategic autonomy. I mean, we criticize the way strategic autonomy concept is interpreted by the policymakers in the Turkish context. Because, I mean, if we look at the theoretical underpinnings of this concept, strategic autonomy relies on structural opportunities, political willingness of actors, and material capabilities. So I said 2 dimensions are particularly important and different from previous periods. The first one is about structural transformation. I mean, in the first decade of the Justice and Development Party, we see that Turkey acted as a good citizen of liberal international order, right? I mean, Turkey was a negotiating member state with the European Union. There were certain problems with the United States, but clearly the situation was not as dramatic as it is now. So in terms of being part of liberal international order, we see that there is, I think, a clear distinction. Turkey is now considered itself as a member of Global South, and this is highlighted in a much more assertive terms. And in terms of regime dynamics as well, I mean, we at the time saw trying to socialize within liberal political order and rule-based market economy. When we look at the last decade, from a political point of view, we see certain democratic backsliding. Turkey is increasing its cooperation with Russia and China, despite this relationship is also fragile, asymmetric, and susceptible to reversals. From an economic point of view, when we look at the political economy dimension, in the first decade of the Justice and Development Party, we see that the main guiding paradigm was kind of rule-based market economy based on post-Washington consensus. But in the current context, we see that there is a variety of state capitalism making its way into Turkish political economy, which is a distinct political economy paradigm than the first decade. So I think I should stop here. But these are the two fundamental differences, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. It's quite clear. And also it will be interesting to further explore, basically, because on the one hand, you see the quest for strategic autonomy. On the other hand, you see actually increasing dependency on actors like Russia and China, and maybe what we call as the quest for strategic autonomy is another way for saying quest for dependency reduction on the West. Katerina, the Middle East has become, in a sense, the context within which the Turkish foreign policy has been discussed and contested the most in recent years. So, and you recently see the Turkey try to kind of recalibrate its Middle East policy. So how do you see Turkey's place in the Middle East is changing?
Thank you, Galip. As you said earlier, this is a very, very hotly contested and debated question. And what my article seeks to do is take stock of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East, present its basic elements, but also offer an argument, an interpretation about this policy. So I have a short 5 minutes, and I'll make 2 points in these 5 minutes. The first is with regards to perspective. It is of the essence here. This is not just about context. And when I say perspective, I mean how it is that the Middle East fits within the broader context of Turkish foreign policy in comparison to other regions. Now, the most common way of approaching this question, which my article contests and disputes, is through the East-West perspective. This takes the form of a question often. Where is Turkey heading? Is it heading east or is it heading west? And this is usually read in a zero-sum way. If Turkey is moving east, it must be abandoning the West and vice versa. So the article is saying that this Huntingtonian perspective, even though it is actually shared by the overwhelming majority of Turkish foreign policy makers, including the president, Recep Erdoğan, is in fact unhelpful in understanding Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East. This is because of the nature of foreign policy itself, which I try to explain in the paper. Foreign policy is a multifaceted, multi-level game without a focus and a purpose. Even though policymakers say it has one, more often than not, it does not. And what we see in every foreign policy is that different areas in that policy operate in contradiction to one another or outside the headlines in the sort of quiet zone, so to speak. So the paper starts with this absolutely essential context setting, and it is in fact one of the two arguments of the paper, that we have to discard this way of thinking about purpose, about pivot, about one region being the natural region for Turkish foreign policy, because this is not how it works. Now, the second point of the paper, and the main argument of the paper with regards to the actual Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East and how it is done, is about ideology and pragmatism, and or what I call power projection, which is in the title of the paper. An important point here is that when I talk about ideology in the paper and post-ideology, I do not just refer to Islamism, but I also include strands of thinking such as neo-Ottomanism and civilizationalism. I'm happy to take questions about that later on. Following on from my interpretation of foreign policy in general as a multi-level, multi-directional game lacking in focus, I make a specific case with regards to the issue of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East. First of all, that ideology has always been secondary in AKP's foreign policy in the Middle East. It's been secondary to security, pragmatic, and material interests. This is not to say it's not been important. It has, but it has never been the dominant driver of AKP's foreign policy in the region, or indeed anywhere else. Now, the subtle point here is that there is an exception to this overarching interpretation. This exception is in the brief 2-3 years after the 2011 Arab uprisings. During that time, ideology, Islamism, but also more broadly interpreted, became more important because there was an opportunity in the Middle East as a result and as a product of the overthrow of a number of regimes there. So the conditions were right for ideology to become more important. However, by the middle of the decade, by the middle of the 2010s, as Muslim Brotherhood movements declined in the region, as turmoil and instability and civil war started to spread, and as domestic politics requirements within Turkey caused a shift of the AKP towards a more conventional nationalist position, we see a decline, again, a relegation of ideology to its sort of background position as it had been before. From 2015 onwards, and this is what the bulk of the paper does, there is a gradual predominance of what I call a power projection, pragmatic type of policy, and also what I call a sort of post-ideological phase comes into being as ideology becomes even further relegated to the sidelines. So the 2015 rough turning point is crucial. Now, the bulk of the paper and what a lot of it does is provide detail of Turkish foreign policy in 4 sub-regions. First of all, what I call the near abroad, Syria and Iraq. Secondly, the wider Arab world. Thirdly, Israel, Palestine. And fourthly, Iran. So I divide the Middle East into these 4 sub-regions. And in most of the paper, this is what I do. I trace how, within the context of a pragmatic policy, after ideology becomes briefly more important in the first part of the decade, from 2015 onwards, we have the gradual sort of predominance of pragmatic power projection, post-ideological considerations. So thank you very much. This is what I have to say.
Thank you. Actually, I have a follow-up question here as well too. I mean, one of them is a bit future-oriented. If we assume that right now, in a sense, we are experiencing a post-ideological phase in Turkey's foreign policy in the Middle East, does that mean there is greater opportunity for Turkey to mend ties with countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Israel? Because particularly when you look at the nature of contest between countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Egypt, it has been more ideological and personal in nature rather than geopolitical. So in a sense, like, the ideological element has conditioned the geopolitical element as well too. So first one, do you anticipate then less of tension between Turkey and those countries? And secondly, I mean, after the Arab Spring, there was a contest for a new regional order, and this contest had a clear ideological connotation as well too. What defines today's contest when it comes to power rivalries, including Turkey across the region, if it's not ideological?
Well, with regards to your first question, the answer is yes. So I show, for example, in the case of Israel, that after 2016, we see a mending of the fences of a relationship that had gone sort of badly wrong for a variety of reasons, partly ideological reasons. In the case of Saudi Arabia, again, we see a mending of the fences on pragmatic considerations, despite all the disagreements and the problems and the rest of it. With Egypt, it's harder, but there is, I think, an opening in that direction, and we perhaps see hints of that already in the making. Now, in all of these cases, and this is the point of the piece, we are never in a black and white situation. We can never say it's either ideology or pragmatism. This is not how this works. There's always a sort of a nuanced balancing between the two things. And the point to understand, and what I'm hoping to show in the paper, is that ideology is never forgotten, but it's in an interplay, in a kind of relationship with other considerations, and its role goes up and down depending on the broader context. Now, with regards to the region as a whole, I think the point here is that the region has been in such turbulence in the past few years, following the overthrow of a number of regimes in the Arab world, that inevitably security has taken hold in many of the sub areas here, as sort of everyone sort of grapples for security, and I think this means that at least for the near future, there's going to be a more sort of pragmatic set of relationships and sort of considerations at play in the entirety of the international relations of the region.
Thank you very much. Ariel, basically, the title of your piece is also the question that I should pose you: Turkey's changing engagement with the global south. So how the Turkey's relation with the global south is changing, because as you also indicated, once the global south was invoked in Turkish foreign policy, and it straddles the nexus of humanitarianism, the trading state discourse, and then soft power emphasis of the Turkish foreign policy, Turkish decision makers. So now, how this story is changing?
Well, thank you, Galip. 30 years ago, the Turkish foreign policy towards the global south was not a topic at all, almost anecdotes. A Western-centered vision would portray the West as the major partner and foreign policy orientation was still at the core of the Ankara's diplomacy. 3 decades later, nowadays, Turkey is a global south actor. Maybe not the most relevant, but increasingly present in different issue areas, from humanitarian and developmental aid to military engagement. Turkey's projection as a global actor has been swift and effective. The international vision of the Justice and Development Party was critical in that sense, but Erdogan's commitment to go global was even more important, especially after 27 backlash at the European membership negotiation process. As an example, Erdogan visited more African countries than any other non-African leader. So in the last 2 decades, Ankara had doubled its diplomatic presence worldwide, opening 30 embassies in Africa and a dozen in Latin America. A group of state-related institutions quickly expanded throughout the non-Western world. Yunus Emre Institute, TICA, the Presidency for Turks Abroad, TÜBİTAK, both providing scholarships, in addition to media brands such as TRT, World, and Anatolian Agency. So this soft power package was a key source of attractiveness in the global south, but wasn't alone. Until the 2010s, a long-term transformation into an emerging tiger supports a role model which involves not only this neoliberal successful transformation, but also political democratization and a responsible role as stakeholder in the international order. So this benign phase of the Turkey's engagement with the global south start to be altered as the regional security dynamics after the Arab Spring and the increasing tensions within the Turkish political system unfold. And in this context, two questions that we present in the paper are critical. How did regional security and democratic backsliding undermine this benign nature of the Turkish foreign policy? And in what ways Ankara channeled its economist challenges into its approach toward the global south? So the article that's we published with Federico Donelli presents a particular argument that this southern orientation, especially in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, has lost its constructive and developmental direction as a result of a complex interactions between, on one hand, the regional upheaval in the Turkish neighborhood, talking about the post-Arab Spring environment, and on the other, the domestic democratic backsliding, coupled with Erdogan's executive centralization, especially after the failed coup of 15 July 2015. This combination of factors have two main consequences. First, the priorities have shifted from economic growth, investment, trade, towards security concerns, with repercussions to this benign approach toward the global south. Second, the self-aggrandment of the executive in Ankara shapes an increasingly centralized foreign policy in which the presidential diplomacy become even more relevant, and also the political affinity with the leader. So in that sense, these become central features of the regional policies toward Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Ariel, yes, please finish your sentence.
No, that's.
In your piece, you emphasize that the global south gained prominence in Turkish foreign policy as part of Turkey's quest for global activeness. The fact now the global south has become less prominent in Turkish foreign policy, does that mean that Turkey now has less quest or has less motivation for a global role? Does that mean that Turkey is more and more reducing or downsizing its aspiration to a regional level rather than a global level?
Thanks. This is a very interesting question. Clearly not. At the moment, Turkey still pursues a global actorship, even his priorities has changed. So the Turkish engagement in a global south now is more focused on other issues, but still Turkey try to position itself as a critical actor, both regionally and also an actor with presence globally. So the main changes in the agenda of Turkey in the global south were related to the struggle against the Gulen network, which branches involves even Latin American countries such as Panama, polemical relations with Venezuela, in which political affinity and a certain troubled relation with the US have some elements, and also pressure in multilateral organizations related to the Turkish position regarding, for example, the Syrian civil war and the human rights abuses in that conflict. So even if the global south become less relevant for Turkey, still has a place in the Turkish foreign policy that is heavily intertwined with domestic politics, as also Mustafa could like argue. So the exploitation of anti-Western rhetoric, the advancements of a domestic security agenda, and exploitations of economic opportunities are part of this agenda that is not only related to regional priorities, but also to global aspirations. In sum, Turkey in the global south means Turkey trying to improve their status in global politics.
Thank you. Well, right now we have quite many questions actually, so I will try to group them because some of them has a similar connotations. But before that, once again, let me remind you that this session is on record. So it's being recorded and it will be available in the upcoming weeks. So you can check these sessions in the upcoming weeks as well too. And then secondly, the link of the 3 articles, you can find these links in the chat box. So please do not forget to read these 3 excellent pieces. So now the questions actually, Katerina, it seems many questions in one way or another relate to you. Let me start with the question that actually I also posed you. It seems one of the participants also would like you to a bit expand on it more. Fernando Herrero, the obvious question, he says, what does post-ideological means? What does post-ideological mean? The blurb says that the civilization categories don't hold. So in this regard, what does post-ideological exactly means when you use this concept? Well, and then another question again, like, maybe you can answer it. I think that's also very much relevant to you. How do Turkey at this stage is navigating the regional blocs or the rivalry among the regional blocs, most importantly between the Saudi UAE versus the Iran bloc? And then thirdly, basically, how sustainable is the Turkish foreign policy also recent years? I mean, this also I would like to pose to you, given that this discussion also usually takes place with reference to Turkey's activism in Middle East and North Africa, but maybe to other regions as well too.
Well, as I said in my introduction, I do not want to limit ideology to Islamism, because I think there's a broader school of thought. There's no time here to go into the ins and outs of the domestic situation, which leads to one strand perhaps becoming more important at times and all the rest of it. So it's a kind of fuzzy thing, which includes Islamism, but it also includes neo-Ottomanism and what I call civilizationalism. Now, what do I mean by post-ideology? I mean the period where, if we accept my argument that post-2011 there was a kind of an upsurge of these concerns because of the opportunities in the region in Turkish foreign policy, we now see a decline of these concerns as pragmatic security power considerations become predominant. So this is how I define post-ideology. With regards to the second question, it's a very interesting one because it kind of assumes that there's always a link, or that there's an overarching panopticon sort of, if that's the right word, or a management of Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East as a whole. But often in reality, when we get to the nitty-gritty of it, the reality of it is that relationships are bilateral. They're managed bilaterally and not sort of in harmony with other relationships. So what happens, for example, between Turkey and Iran is about the relationship between Turkey and Iran, not necessarily linked always to what is happening between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, or Turkey and Israel. So this is what the paper is doing. It's kind of tracing the details of these four, but also argues that each of the four are its own little world, so to speak. It operates autonomously in the subregions. Now you have to repeat the third one, Galip, because there were three questions and I lost the thread. I've forgotten what the third question was.
Well, actually, let me also add two more questions, because while you're speaking, the questions are coming. Another question: does civilization category still play a part in Turkish foreign policy? And another one is basically how central Erdoğan is in our analysis of Turkish foreign policy. And the third one, how central is the coup attempt of 2016 in the changing direction of Turkish foreign policy? So I can add you more questions.
Okay. Well, I think the civilizational perspective has really had its day a little bit with the passing of from office, of course, only of Davutoglu, but also with the upsurge of security considerations in the region. We see a decline of the civilizational perspective. And even though a whole industry was built around it in Turkey and it still exists, it's, I think, become less prominent. It's used perhaps opportunistically, but not necessarily has the centrality that it had before. When it comes to Erdoğan, perhaps I can take this in conjunction with the coup attempt question. We definitely see institutionally a centralization, a further, I would say, centralization of Turkish foreign policy after 2016. So this has been the result of the presidential system, the referendum, and the constitutional changes, but also the reality of the concentration of power in the hands of Erdoğan. Now, I'm not going to interpret his mindset in 2 minutes, but I just want to say that even though, as I said earlier, he operates along the lines of East and West, there's also, I think, an underlying pragmatism in how he deals with issues. Perhaps also an impossibility of one person to deal with everything in a coherent way. So even though we do have centralization of power and centralization in foreign policy making, this hasn't necessarily made foreign policy more coherent and more consistent between its different parts, because it is impossible, even for someone who's so powerful as Erdoğan, to control everything. Foreign policy has it operates on so many different levels and in so many different areas: economic, political, security, intelligence, people relations, transnational relations, ideational relations, that you cannot have one person control it in fact.
Thank you. Mustafa, actually, there are a few questions that I can pose it to you as well, too. The first one is the role of economy. Mm-hmm. Is economy turning into a constraining factor for Turkish foreign policy? The second one is Russia. I mean, there are two questions on Russia. One of them is, what were the, how should we understand the improving relations, increasingly close relation between Turkey and Russia since 2016? And secondly, where does Russia stands in Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy? Is Russia facilitating Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy or not?
Mm-hmm. Right, Guy, thank you very much for these excellent questions. Just to reiterate, in the paper, actually, we argue that the recent foreign policy behavior informs a suboptimal equilibrium with two destabilizing aspects. One, a modus operandi of recurring crisis mode in relations with the West. Two, a growing risk of dependence on non-Western great powers. And actually, there's a political economy dimension in it, or economic dimension in it. Because, I mean, even if Turkey and European Union or Western actors have certain problems currently, still Western powers are Turkey's main economic partners. I mean, half of Turkey's foreign trade is with the West, I mean, European Union and United States. Almost 70% of foreign direct investments come from the European Union. So it's a huge volume, right? And even if relations will take a transactionalist turn, or is taking a transactionalist turn in the current context, we can suggest that economic ties with the European Union or other forms of cooperation will continue on a transactionalist basis. But the thing is that the growing security risks, the growing trust problems, or the deterioration of institutional ties with the European Union, our Western actors, actually undermines Turkey's economic potential, because the foreign direct investment, I mean, volume of foreign direct investment declines, the quality of foreign direct investment declines. And when we look at Turkey's trade relations with the European Union, we see a much balanced equilibrium. I mean, for instance, just to give you a basic figure, export-import ratio, when it comes to Turkey's trade relations with the European Union, we see that it is 95%, quite balanced. But this ratio is just 18% when it comes to Turkey's trade relations with BRICS countries. I mean, when I say BRICS, please take it Russia and China, because these are the two most important trade partners for Turkey. And most of these trade relations actually is Turkey's imports from those countries. So what I am suggesting is that the current crisis mode with the Western actors creates important economic issues for Turkey as well. So there is a kind of economic crisis going on in the country right now, and we should take this dimension into consideration as well. So my answer to the first question is that I think we should be careful about the shifts in international order and what Turkey's closer relations with non-Western powers mean. I'm not suggesting that Turkey should not develop relations with those actors. Quite the contrary. I mean, the world is really changing, but it's also important to look at the composition of these trade relations or investment relations. Actually, that's why in the paper we argued that in the Turkish context, there is a limit to autonomous foreign policy behavior, and it has political economy fundamentals for Turkey. So post-Western order does not mean non-Western order or Westlessness, as it was put in Munich Security Conference. I mean, it's a really, really complex process that should be interpreted carefully and navigated meticulously. And there is a political economy dimension in it. Regarding, go ahead, please.
No, please go.
Yeah, I was gonna say a few things about Turkey-Russia relations, but if you have a question, please just go ahead.
Let me actually add to this. One of the questions is about Erdogan's often emphasis on the world is bigger than five, in which he problematized the UN Security Council not being representative of today's world. So what does this tell us about the, the Turkish or the Erdogan's vision of internationalism? And then finally, maybe the question of sustainability. How sustainable is the current trajectory of the Turkish foreign policy? And are there major differences between the opposition and government when it comes to foreign policy files?
Well, I think this is also an important question, because when we look at Turkish foreign policy behavior over the last decade or so, we see that there are two sometimes conflicting drivers. I mean, on the one hand, international order is shifting, and Turkey is, for understandable reasons, trying to develop closer relations with non-Western powers. Russia, China, as Ariel mentioned, trying to become a much more assertive actor in Latin America, Africa, and this is understandable. I mean, all states are trying to do this, but the main issue is that there are certain limits for such a kind of aggressive or assertive, foreign policy behavior. Turkish foreign policy needs an anchor. All states actually need an anchor in their foreign policy priorities. I understand that, Turkish policymakers are advocating multipolarity, like several other states in the global south. They want kind of democratization in global governance. These actors from global south are becoming much more important in global economic and political affairs, and obviously they want to make their voices heard in international platforms, including IMF, World Bank, United Nations, etc. And Turkey is part of this trend. They want democratization of global governance, which is understandable. The thing is that we need to understand the political economy priorities in the Turkish case. This shouldn't come at the expense of undermining relations with Western powers. I completely understand that there are certain structural issues going on with the EU, and I think part of the blame should be put on the European Union, because relations started deteriorating well before 2011, right? After 2005, we see gradual deterioration in Turkey's relations with the European Union. So there's a kind of credibility of commitment problem on part of the EU as well. And the recent migration deal, for instance, is suboptimal, if we put it lightly, because Turkey developed a kind of interest-based relationship with the European Union. So when it comes to opposition's position in foreign policy issues, this is my final comment, Galip, I think I do not see a significant difference, actually, because government likes to frame issues within the context of national security, right? When it comes to foreign affairs, we see a kind of securitization of foreign policy behavior or moves. And in most cases, main opposition parties are not eager to challenge government, right, on that particular ground. So I'm not sure what opposition parties think about shifting international order, where Turkey should stand in a shifting international order, and how Turkey should recalibrate its relations with Western powers and non-Western actors. So I don't have a clear answer to this question because of the incoherent approach of opposition parties, in my opinion.
Thank you. Ariel, actually, a few questions to you. First, the TİKA, Turkish Development Agency, and the Diyanet, how effective are those institutions in Turkish foreign policy formulation? And secondly, one of the participants is asking about Mikta. None of you so far has mentioned Mikta. Does that indicate that the relevance of that partnership has changed? And how do you see its future?
Thank you. There are two very interesting questions. Regarding the second one, Mikta is still a low-profile informal fora for middle powers. So there were some expectations years ago that this forum could be something like BRICS, which heads of states meet every year and discuss a broader agenda. But at the moment, it's still only a foreign minister of foreign affairs meeting. The nature in which this forum started developing in the first years was kind of an alliance of middle responsible powers, democracies with an open perspective in terms of political economy, in good relation with the West. I think that there is still some ground to make this informal partnership more relevant in terms of global politics, but the perspectives are not so positive at the moment. So especially regarding the will of some of these countries to like put this fora in a higher like position in world affairs. Regarding the role of Diyanet and TICA, I think both are critical for foreign policy outcomes, especially in the global south. Diyanet plays a key role in terms of religious diplomacy. Even in Latin America, his arrival is very, very novel. In Africa, have a lot. His network have a lot of development, and in the case of TICA, I think has been the best phase of the Turkish foreign policy toward the global south. Turkey invest thousands of millions in terms of developmental aid that were canalized by TICA. TICA have a worldwide reach, and even in many countries of Latin America, thanks to the opening of the office in Bogota, have received different aid from like support from schools and other kind of aid. So at the end, I think these two tools, the two institutions, will stay in the future. It will still show in a very good phase of the Turkish diplomacy in the global south, but nowadays are not the main priority of the diplomatic agenda. But I think Turkey should continue to invest in this kind of soft power packaging to revive the good old times.
Thank you very much. Katerina, actually 2 or 3 questions, but also for 2 minutes. I don't know how we are going to manage it. The first one is on Turkey-Iran. What do you anticipate in terms of the rivalry in the Middle East between them, given the fact that more and more we are witnessing to the downsizing of the Western footprint in the region? So how do you anticipate the Turkish-Iranian rivalry to evolve? Secondly, Cyprus. What do you anticipate, like what holds for the future of this unresolved crisis? I just had another question as well too. So would you, that basically ask whether Turkey will remain an ally for the West in the Middle East. So 2 minutes and good luck.
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about Cyprus because it's not my topic. So I'm going to discuss the Iran-Turkey relationship, which is in fact such a fascinating one, because even though we see between the two countries an ideological rivalry, which sort of assumed sort of more important dimensions in post-2011 Syria in particular, there's always with Iran a kind of an ability and a tendency to quietly get on with the job of being good neighbors. So we see that in the economic sense. We see that in sort of cooperating perhaps on some common causes, such as the Palestinian cause. And there's never a breakdown of relations. I think that we have seen, for example, between Iran, between Turkey and Egypt. So in the paper, I argued that this will continue, and that, of course, the main issue here is Syria. There's also the question of Iraq. But again, there, what we see is that even in that context of ongoing rivalry and sort of bloody rivalry, very often, there's also a possibility of working together to resolve common issues. We saw that in Astana, for example. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, Mustafa, if you'd like to answer the Cyprus question in 30 seconds, you are welcome. Otherwise.
No, Galip, I'm counting on you on this question. If you want to comment, please go ahead.
No, I will confine to my moderation role. So I would like to thank all the speakers that this has been a fascinating conversation. Katerina, Mustafa, Ariel, thank you very much. I would like to also thank the International Affairs team, Isabel, Ben, and all other teams for putting together this excellent webinar. And also, please bear in mind that the next International Affairs webinar is going to be on 28 July, which is the next Wednesday. And the title is The Technology and De-Extremization in Xinjiang, China. So please do register for the next event that is going to be a week time from now. And also, please do not forget to read these 3 excellent articles that the authors have just presented to you today. So once again, thank you very much on behalf of the International Affairs and Chatham-House, and hope to see you at our next week's webinar on Wednesday. So thank you very much.